F1 has given itself a problem that it has tried and failed to fix in 2024. Ed, fill everybody in. What are we talking about?
Yeah, it's the thorny question of time penalties for track limits violations, specifically when overtaking another car. Previously, it was 5 seconds, which was the minimum they gave, and that was pretty much always what they dished out. But now it's gone up to 10 seconds, but it still hasn't solved the problem. And it's just this endless cycle of talking about penalties. It's been going on for years now in Formula One, and this latest change doesn't really cut it.
Why is that? I think penalties have become a ridiculous situation in F1 because it feels like we're trying to fine-tune them all the time to almost get to this point where the punishment is equal to the crime. That seems needless to me. Are we too concerned now with penalties almost being gentle, and then you get into this situation that we've got where the teams and the drivers can kind of decide actually a gentle penalty is worth taking here?
Yeah, I think you're right that it's a philosophical question in that sometimes people say penalties are too harsh, but really the object of any penalty should be to penalise and correct the violation, shouldn't it? So if you can overtake somebody and go off track in doing so, and you shouldn't be there, and then you can sit there for however many laps interfering with the race, that's the fundamental problem. And I think that's the thing. You can't come up with a commensurate penalty for that does not remove the situation of you being in the way. That's the simple philosophical question. Whether it's 5, 10, 20 seconds, if the car is still there, it's in a place it shouldn't be.
That's my problem with F1's penalty situation at the moment. Too many of the penalties are this time penalty that you serve either at the next pit stop or even at the end of the race if there's not another pit stop to come. I don't understand why, if you do something wrong, if you commit an offence that's worthy of a penalty, you should be penalised there and then, because otherwise you get this chance to run your race differently to account for the penalty, and that's not how this should work. And I feel like the penalties we have at the moment, these time penalties, are not a deterrent because they allow people to weigh up if they're worth taking. And how do we end up in this situation with all these kind of incremental time penalties that I don't think have made the situation any better than it was before?
Well, there was once a point where the penalties were draconian, like you jumped the start, you got a 1 minute penalty, something like that. It was really very much quite rare, but you got your race pretty much ruined by it. And then they tried to fine tune it more, and you get these questions of what's the right punishment. It's always focused on the car doing the violations rather than focusing on the effect on the really wider race. And I think you've also got the other factor that track limits are such a big issue now in all of motorsport, not just Formula One, because tracks have changed from being self-policing in terms of track limits, i.e. you have gravel or a wall or just something there that holds you up, to ones where there is space. And I don't think motorsport as a whole has ever really caught up with that. But I think until the focus is over and above what's an appropriate penalty, etc., is what penalty ensures the negative impact you might have on the race through taking that penalty, through committing the offence rather, is addressed. Until you do that, I don't think you get the right solution, because you will get people, as you alluded to, effectively spending penalties. Hang on a minute, this costs us this amount of seconds, but actually it's a net gain, not just for the individual driver, but maybe for the whole team.
There was an example that could have been a case of that. I don't think it was, in the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, where Sergio Perez got a time penalty for an unsafe release during his pit stop in the safety car. Checo said it was his mistake. That's fine. But there is actually a situation there where a team, and this is crazy, I hope nobody will do it, but a team can weigh up. Are we better off firing this car out into the fast lane and hoping that the people behind back up, take a penalty rather than losing track position? Track position is so important in F1. That's why this is such an issue. Because as you say, people would rather have a little bit of time added onto their race rather than the time loss of being sent further back in the queue. What do you think the solution is here? Because for me, I much prefer penalties being too harsh rather than too lenient. Because I look at it as this: if you rob a bank, you don't just get told give the money back at your earliest convenience. Like, you serve a big punishment for that. I think it should be like this in F1 as well, because it's not just about redressing the balance from the offence that took place. You should make people not want to commit the offence in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the case of that pit stop example, you said it's a massive safety issue as well. So you want to make sure no one's
That's why I don't
vaguely
think a team would do it, but it's an example of what they could be forced to think about.
Exactly. And the way you police the rules and the way the rules are is the way you force people to play the game. And that's why things such as drive-through penalties, I think, should be used a little bit more. The drive-through penalty is still there. So's the stop-go penalty, where you come into the pit stop and then take off again, which is obviously the most extreme one. But they're almost never used because they're, say, for the most serious offences. But I think unless you have something that effectively takes you out of the race and removes your car from a position it shouldn't be in, and does so very, very quickly, you have a problem, because you might be able to wait ages before you serve a penalty. If you've got a 5-second penalty, say at a pit stop, it doesn't happen until your next pit stop. If it's an unsafe release, it might be 20, 30 laps. So you are fundamentally transforming the race. You have bought the right to change the race, influence cars behind, by taking that penalty, and that's the fundamental problem.
Yeah, you mentioned there kind of a car's ability to impact the race and impact the race of others. That brings us on neatly to Haas and Kevin Magnussen in Saudi Arabia, where quite cleverly, you could say, Kevin kind of backed up the rest of the field to give teammate Nico Hülkenberg a gap so that he can make a pit stop and stay in the points. Now, Alan Permain from RB called this unsportsmanlike from Haas. I think this problem highlights what we're talking about, what we don't like about time penalties, but was what Haas did unsportsmanlike, or was it genius?
Well, it was both, and it wasn't unsportsmanlike as well, because the sport is defined by the regulations ultimately and the way they're policed, and you should not be able to do something unsportsmanlike. The rules have to prevent that. It's not down to you to decide how you should or shouldn't do it. So ultimately, Magnussen went past Sonoda, and in doing so, he exceeded track limits very, very clearly. There was no doubt about it. Magnussen knew it when it happened. Everyone watching. I remember watching the onboard with Esteban Ocon, who was behind him, and he was straight on the radio saying, well, he's just bust track limits there. So he was ahead, and it was after he'd made that move that they decided they were going to use Magnussen to back up the group at the back to allow Hülkenberg ultimately to score a point. So Magnussen was able to influence the race of 5 or 6 other drivers by buying that advantage. And it didn't make any difference to his personal race, because his race was run anyway. He already had a 10-second penalty even before the track limits one, so 20 seconds of penalties in total. But he was able to help Hülkenberg, and I think that's a great illustration of the problem. And to come back to the question of whether it's sporting or not, that's where the FIA needs to come in and say, do you know what? We want a situation where if a car is in a place that it should not be, because of an infringement, we need to get it out of the way as quickly as possible. So for my money, that means if you do it, you drop back as soon as possible. And Magnussen will have known. He could have lifted off and then gone about trying to pass Sonoda correctly thereafter. If you don't do that, you get a drive-through. And if the drive-through's too harsh, well, you should have dropped back. And maybe there'll be the odd case where it's really, really fine margins and not clear cut. You can find a protocol for that. But for 95% of these cases, they know. And you can just say, right, it's down to you to give it back. Because this all comes back to, there used to be a procedure where it was advisory from, it used to be Charlie Whiting would give his opinion on whether they should give a place back, just to help them out in terms of the judgment before it maybe went to the stewards. And it wasn't binding, that advisory. But it's just all a carryover of this. And we've had this creeping untidiness in all this growing over the years. And it's just not getting any better.
I think it's another example of letting the competitors, be like the drivers or the teams, have too much say as well, because they're always going to tell you, if you're the FIA making the rules, the penalties are too harsh, you need to have more equalised penalties, and that just makes no sense to me, because if the penalties are too harsh, and I think we both agree that a drive-through is a great idea. MotoGP has the long lap penalty, which is a small, it tends to be 2 or 3 seconds you lose by going sort of off at a corner and going wide. But again, they have to serve it within 2 or 3 laps. The penalty is immediate, which tackles what you said, Ed, about that car can't be where it has got itself illegally for a long duration of time. You mentioned the FIA there, and I think you called it a creep from a kind of era of trying to be a bit more advisory. How much faith do you have in the FIA? I can't believe I'm asking this. In the FIA's ability to get this situation under control and to come up with a proper fix?
Not a vast amount, I must admit. I think this has become overcomplicated, and there's too much back and forth and debate with the drivers. And I think, to come back to a point I made earlier, the philosophical approach has been all wrong for a long time in terms of what you're trying to do. It's not about taking away the advantage you gain. It should be about preventing you disadvantaging competitors. And I think Mohammed Ben Sulayem's FIA has made a big thing about being the rightful regulator of F1. They're the regulator, the custodian of Grand Prix racing, effectively, and they are. But this is an area where I think they can really, really clamp down on it and take an approach that does preserve that sporting integrity and makes things work really well from a regulatory perspective. Just say, right, do you know what? If you're ahead of someone and you shouldn't be, we're going to give you a big penalty. There's a way for you to avoid it. Just give back the place. You know when it's a problem. And that will just prevent this kind of thing happening. Because like I say, competitors will play according to the rules and the way the rules are policed. So Alan Permain was both right and wrong to say it was unsporting for them to do that. And I wouldn't be surprised if the RB team that Alan Permain's now at would do a similar thing if roles were reversed. Don't blame the player, blame the game ultimately. And it's the FIA's job to make sure that the game is policed right and works well. And this trouble, as I said, comes back to this track limits issue with the way modern tracks are now. It's never really been got on top of. What a great opportunity now for the FIA to do that and for F1 to set an example that all racing categories can follow worldwide.